Before we begin, if you want the full continuation of these stories, more uncensored 18+ Ancient BL content, extended scenes, and unlimited royal forbidden romance, you can join us on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. YouTube does not allow us to show or monetize everything freely here, so the deeper and more intense versions are waiting for you there. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. Now, let me tell you a story about a palace, a ghost, and a man who learned too late how to love. I remember the exact moment I realized I had died. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. There were no flashing lights, no cinematic review of a life lived in modern cities with neon signs, electric heaters, and the hum of subway trains. There was only a sudden, crushing cold and the smell of moldy silk. I opened my eyes, and my lungs dragged in a breath of air that tasted like old dust and bitter herbs. I was lying on a wooden floor that had rotted in the corners. Above me, an intricately carved wooden ceiling, painted with dragons that had long since lost their gold leaf, stared down at me. My body felt incredibly heavy, and yet completely hollow. It took me about 3 hours of lying on that freezing floor to piece together the catastrophe I had just inherited. The memories that flooded my mind didn't belong to me. They belonged to a young man named Prince Shen. He was a hostage prince from the defeated northern Yan kingdom, sent to the imperial capital of Great Zhao as a living, breathing treaty. But Prince Shen had a fatal flaw. In a palace full of wolves, he had chosen to fall in love with the most dangerous one of them all, Lord Wei, the Grand General and Regent Prince of Zhao. The original Prince Shen had spent 3 years humiliating himself for Lord Wei. He had embroidered pouches for him, only to see them tossed into the mud. He had stood in the freezing snow for hours, just to catch a glimpse of the general riding back from the borders. He had swallowed poison, willingly, just to prove his loyalty, when the Yan kingdom was accused of a rebellion. That poison was what killed him. It was a slow, degrading death in this abandoned western courtyard, completely forgotten by the man he worshipped. Prince Shen had died weeping, clutching a torn piece of a black cloak that had once belonged to Lord Wei. I sat up, my joints popping in protest, and looked at the torn black fabric still gripped in my hand. In my past life, I was an archivist, a quiet man who liked things organized, predictable, and logical. I liked old books, warm tea, and living alone. I had died quietly of a heart defect in my sleep at 32. I looked at the torn cloak, then looked around the freezing, miserable room. I did not inherit Prince Shen's desperate, burning love. That had died with him, dissolving into the freezing air before I ever took my first breath in his body. What I inherited was a failing body, a terrible reputation, and a drafty room with no firewood. I dropped the black cloak on the floor, stood up on shaking legs, and went to find a broom. If I was going to live in a miserable royal prison, I was at least going to make sure the floor was swept. 3 weeks passed. In the palace, 3 weeks is both a lifetime and a blink of an eye. I survived by being invisible. The original Prince Shen would loudly demand to see Lord Wei, throwing fits that only resulted in rations being cut. I simply stopped asking. When the palace servants brought my food, usually cold rice and slightly sour vegetables, I thanked them calmly, ate it without complaint, and went back to my work. I had found a cracked clay stove in the courtyard, patched it with river mud, and started boiling my own water. I gathered dead branches from the overgrown plum trees outside my window. I found a stash of discarded, damaged books in the abandoned study next door, and spent my days repairing their bindings with rice paste. I was, for the first time since my transmigration, perfectly content. And then, the door opened. It didn't just open, it was shoved open with the kind of aggressive, impatient force that belongs only to someone who has never been told no in his entire life. I was sitting by my patched clay stove, carefully blowing on a cup of hot water. I had no tea leaves, but hot water is a comfort of its own, when the Grand General, Lord Wei, stepped into my courtyard. I knew his face from the original's memories, but memories are a poor substitute for the real thing. The man was a storm contained inside military armor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as dark and sharp as obsidian. He wore black silk trimmed with silver, and the very air around him felt heavy, suffocating. He looked at me, expecting something. In the past, the original Shen would have thrown himself at Lord Wei's feet, weeping, begging for a single word, asking if the general had read his letters. I took a slow sip of my hot water. I let the silence stretch. The courtyard was completely quiet. Two armored guards stood behind Lord Wei, their hands resting on their sword hilts, their faces tense. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, to make a fool of myself. "You are alive," Lord Wei said. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of warmth. "It appears so," I replied. My voice was raspy from disuse, but calm. I did not stand up. I did not bow. I just looked at him over the rim of my chipped clay cup. Lord Wei's eyes narrowed slightly. It was a microscopic shift, the tightening of a predator's gaze when prey doesn't run. "The imperial physician reported that the poison had reached your heart," he said, stepping closer. His boots crunched against the dead leaves I hadn't yet swept away. "I was told to prepare your burial arrangements." "I apologize for the inconvenience," I said politely. "You can cancel the carpenters. I won't be needing a coffin this week." One of the guards behind him choked on an inhale. Lord Wei stopped. He stared at me. It was the look of a man who had opened a familiar door and stepped into a completely different house. He looked at my clothes, plain, faded gray cotton, lacking the ostentatious reds and golds the original Shen used to wear to catch his attention. He looked at my hands, which were dirty with soot and rice paste, not trembling with desperate desire. "What kind of game is this, Shen?" he asked. The irritation in his voice was thick, but beneath it, there was a tiny, sharp thread of confusion. "No game, Lord Wei," I said. I set my cup down. The ceramic clicked softly against the wooden table. "I survived. I understand my presence here is a political necessity, but a personal nuisance to you. You don't need to visit me to check if I'm causing trouble. I won't. I just want to sit here and read." I looked at him, right in his dark, intense eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. No flutter of the heart, no heat in my cheeks. The body I inhabited had finally, mercifully, let go. "If you are finished assessing my vital signs," I added, picking up a damaged scroll, "I'd like to get back to this. Though, if you are feeling generous, my courtyard hasn't received its charcoal allocation for the month. A single basket would be appreciated." I didn't wait for his answer. I just unrolled the scroll and began to read. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack stone. I could feel Lord Wei standing there. I could feel the sheer, vibrating tension of a man whose reality had just shifted without his permission. He stood there for a full minute. I didn't look up. Finally, I heard the rustle of his heavy silk cloak turning. "Send him a basket of charcoal," Lord Wei snapped at his guards. "And some tea leaves," I added softly to the scroll. "The cheap ones are fine." He paused at the gate. I didn't look, but I knew he was looking back at me. Then, the heavy wooden doors slammed shut. That night, 3 baskets of the highest grade silver needle tea and enough premium charcoal to heat a palace were delivered to my courtyard. I looked at the extravagant items, sighed, and made myself a very good cup of tea. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I had clearly demonstrated my new, peaceful neutrality. I was wrong. When you stop chasing a man who is used to being chased, you don't give him relief. You give him a puzzle, and men like Lord Wei do not like puzzles they cannot solve. A month passed. The weather turned colder, bringing the bitter bite of early winter. With my new charcoal, my room was warm. With my new tea, my mornings were pleasant. I began taking walks. The palace was massive, a sprawling labyrinth of red walls, golden roofs, and hidden courtyards. Since no one actively restricted my movements, mostly because they used to rely on my depression to keep me locked in my room, I started visiting the Imperial Library. The library was located in the northern sector, a quiet, dusty sanctuary filled with towering shelves of bamboo slips, silk scrolls, and bound books. The archivists there were old, tired men who didn't care about royal politics. They only cared that I knew how to properly handle a 400-year-old manuscript. I became a fixture there, sitting in a sunlit corner, copying old texts. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It happened on a Tuesday. The library was empty, save for the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun. I was reaching for a high shelf, trying to retrieve a geographical text on the southern river systems. My fingertips brushed the spine, but I couldn't quite grip it. Suddenly, a large, calloused hand reached past my shoulder, easily pulling the heavy book from the shelf. The scent of cold iron, sandalwood, and a faint hint of war horses wrapped around me instantly. I didn't flinch. I just slowly lowered my arm and turned around. Lord Wei was standing so close to me that the silver embroidery on his chest almost brushed my robes. He was not in his armor today. He wore deep indigo court robes, which made him look less like a general and more like a devastatingly handsome, incredibly dangerous prince. Southern River Systems, Lord Wei read the title, looking down at me. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet library. Planning an escape route, Prince Shen? Planning to educate myself on irrigation, I replied smoothly, holding my hand out for the book. Unless the Grand General considers farming techniques a threat to national security. He didn't hand me the book. Instead, he stepped 1/2 inch closer. He was tall. I had to tilt my head back to look into his eyes. In the past, the original Shen would have melted into a puddle at this proximity. His breath would have hitched. His eyes would have filled with tears of devotion. I just felt a mild annoyance that he was blocking my light. "You've changed," Lord Wei said softly. The words weren't a question. They were an accusation. "Near-death experiences often adjust one's priorities," I said, keeping my hand extended. "My priority is now reading. May I have the book?" Lord Wei's gaze dropped to my extended hand. He stared at it. My fingers were steady. There was a time when just being in the same room as him would make my hands tremble so violently I would hide them in my sleeves. Now, my hand was perfectly still. He slowly lowered the book, placing it into my palm. As he did, his fingers deliberately brushed against mine. His skin was hot, rough from years of swordplay. I didn't pull away quickly. I didn't snatch the book. I just took it with calm, deliberate efficiency, pulling my hand back and stepping around him. "Thank you," I said politely, walking toward my desk. "I did not give you permission to leave," his voice snapped, sharper now, laced with the authority of a man who commands armies. I stopped. I placed the book on the table, turned around, and clasped my hands behind my back. I looked at him with the polite, empty patience of a tutor waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. "What would you like me to do, Lord Wei?" I asked. "Shall I bow? Shall I recite the Treaty of Yan? Tell me what you want, so I can provide it and return to my reading." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping right in front of me. His shadow swallowed me entirely. He reached out, his hand hovering just an inch from my throat. I didn't blink. I didn't lean back. "What do I want?" he murmured, his eyes searching my face, scanning my neutral expression for any crack, any hint of the desperate boy who used to love him. "I want to know where the man who used to look at me like I was the sun has gone." I looked at him, truly looked at him. He was a beautiful man, yes, but he was just a man. "He burned to ash, my lord," I said softly. "You let him freeze, and so he burned himself up just to stay warm. I am all that is left." Lord Wei's hand slowly dropped. Something flickered in his dark eyes, something that looked dangerously like regret, but I knew better than to trust it. "I'll let you read," he said quietly, and turned away. But he didn't leave. He walked to the opposite side of the library, sat down at a desk, and opened a military scroll. For the next 3 hours, we sat in the same room, surrounded by thousands of books. He didn't speak to me, and I didn't speak to him. But every time I turned a page, I could feel his eyes on me, heavy, calculating, and something else, something hungry. And if you are enjoying this forbidden royal tension, remember, the extended and uncensored 18+ continuation is available on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. The link is in the description and pinned comment. The shift in palace dynamics happens slowly, like a tide coming in over dry sand. You don't notice the water rising until your feet are already wet. Lord Wei started appearing in places he had no business being. When I took my morning walks by the frozen lotus pond, I would see him standing on the bridge, speaking with his lieutenants, his eyes tracking my every movement. When I went to the royal kitchens to ask for ginger, my modern soul knew how to fend off a cold. The head chef would suddenly present me with a lacquered box of rare pastries, muttering that the Grand General had ordered the kitchens to stop feeding the Yan Prince garbage. It was irritating. It was also deeply, dangerously confusing. The original Shen had begged for crumbs and received nothing. I wanted nothing, and I was suddenly being offered the whole table. The real test came during the winter solstice banquet. As a hostage prince, my attendance was mandatory. designed purely as a political display of the Yan kingdom's submission. I had expected this. I dressed carefully in the only decent robe I had left, a deep, muted gray silk with faint silver threading. It was understated. It was meant to make me invisible. When I entered the great hall, a cavernous space lit by 1,000 glowing lanterns, the chatter died down. I walked to my assigned seat at the far end of the lower tables. I kept my eyes downcast, moving with quiet dignity. I felt the stares of the Zhao nobility. I heard their whispers. The mad prince, the pathetic dog of Yan. I sat down, poured myself a cup of warm wine, and looked straight ahead. Lord Wei sat at the high table, seated just to the right of the young emperor. He was dressed in terrifyingly magnificent black and gold robes. The moment I sat, his eyes locked onto mine. There was a minister to my left, a bloated, cruel-looking man who clearly wanted to entertain the court at my expense. Prince Shen, the minister slurred loudly, holding up his cup. "We are surprised to see you. We heard you took poison in a fit of broken-hearted madness. Have you finally realized the Grand General will never look at a defeated dog?" The hall went dead silent. Everyone waited for my reaction. In the memories of the original host, situations like this ended with him fleeing the hall in tears, or worse, screaming his devotion to Lord Wei, only to be dragged away by the guards. I picked up my cup of wine. I looked at the minister with cold, unblinking eyes. "Minister," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "If I had truly wanted to die, I would have used a sharper blade, not cheap arsenic. And as for my heart, you flatter yourself to think anyone in this room holds it. Now please turn around. Your breath is ruining the taste of my wine." A few courtiers gasped. Someone at a nearby table let out a choked sound of stifled laughter. The minister's face turned purple. "You insolent Yan trash." He stood up, raising his hand as if to throw his wine at me. Before I could even blink, a sound shattered the air. A silver chopstick flew across the room, striking the minister's wine cup with the force of an arrow. The cup exploded into ceramic shards, splashing wine all over the minister's face and robes. Every head in the room snapped toward the high table. Lord Wei was leaning forward, his arms still outstretched from the throw. His face was a mask of pure, terrifying violence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Minister Liu," Lord Wei said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. "You are disrupting the banquet. Sit down." The minister collapsed into his chair, shaking violently. Lord Wei's dark eyes lifted and met mine across the massive hall. The intensity in his gaze was so heavy, so physically overwhelming, that for the first time since I woke up in this body, my breath hitched. It wasn't fear, it was something else. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He was looking at me with the fierce, possessive fury of a dragon that had just realized someone else was trying to touch its hoard. I broke eye contact, set my cup down, and stared at the table. My heart, the heart that had been completely calm for months, gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. "Dangerous," my modern mind whispered. "This is very, very dangerous." I left the banquet early. I slipped out through a side door, walking quickly through the freezing, snow-covered courtyards. The cold air stung my lungs, but I needed it to clear my head. I was halfway to my courtyard when I heard the heavy crunch of boots in the snow behind me. I walked faster. The footsteps matched my pace. I turned a corner into a narrow, unlit corridor between two garden walls. Before I could take another step, a hand grabbed my arm, spinning me around. I was slammed back against the brick wall. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to trap me. Lord Wei loomed over me, the smell of winter air, wine, and his intoxicating heavy scent wrapped around me, suffocating my senses. He planted one hand on the wall next to my head, trapping me in the shadow of his body. "Running away, Prince Shen?" he whispered, his voice dark and rough. "It is freezing, Lord Wei," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the heat radiating off his body, contrasting violently with the icy wall behind me. "I am going to my room." "You insulted a senior minister," he said, stepping closer. His chest brushed against mine. "He insulted me first," I replied, lifting my chin to glare at him. "Are you here to punish me for defending myself?" "Punish you?" Lord Wei let out a low, breathy sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so devoid of humor. He leaned down, his face so close to mine that I could feel his warm breath ghosting over my lips. A few months ago, you would have let him pour that wine over your head if you thought it would make me look at you. Tonight, you looked at me like I meant nothing. You do mean nothing to me, I lied. The words came out slightly breathless, ruining their impact. Lord Wei's eyes dropped to my lips. His gaze was burning, heavy with a desire that was entirely new, completely unfamiliar to the original memories I possessed. The original Shen had begged for a crumb of this man's attention. Now, Lord Wei was looking at me like he wanted to devour me whole. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his other hand. His rough, calloused fingers brushed a stray lock of hair away from my face. The touch was agonizingly gentle. It sent a shock of heat straight down my spine. "You're lying," he whispered, his thumb lightly tracing the line of my jaw. "Your pulse is racing. I can see it in your throat." "Fear," I breathed, turning my head slightly, though there was nowhere to go. "Not fear," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into something dark and intensely intimate. "You're not afraid of me anymore. That is what drives me mad. You look at me with those cold, empty eyes, and I want to tear the palace apart just to find the man who used to love me." "He's dead," I said firmly, forcing myself to look into his eyes. "I told you, you killed him." Lord Wei's hand moved to the back of my neck, his fingers curling into my hair. He didn't pull, but the grip was absolute. He owned me in this moment. He owned the space, the air, the tension between us. "Then I will just have to make the new you fall in love with me," he murmured against my cheek. He didn't kiss me. He let me go, just as abruptly as he had grabbed me, stepping back into the snow. He looked at me for one long, burning second, then turned and walked away into the dark. I slid down the cold brick wall until I was crouching in the snow, pressing my trembling hands against my chest. My heart was beating so violently, it actually hurt. The game had changed, and I didn't know the rules anymore. Winter deepened into a bitter, relentless freeze. True to his word, Lord Wei began his siege. It was not a siege of flowers and poetry. He was a general. He waged war, and his target was my absolute indifference. He sent his personal physician to my courtyard to examine my lingering cough. When I refused the bitter medicine, Lord Wei came himself, sat at my table, and physically held the bowl to my lips until I drank it, his thumb brushing away a drop that escaped the corner of my mouth. When I went to the library, he was there. He stopped sitting across the room. He sat beside me, close enough that our sleeves touched, close enough that when I reached for the inkstone, his hand would casually cover mine, guiding the brush. I tried to stay cold. I tried to remember the tragic death of the original host. I tried to remind myself that this man was dangerous, a political enemy, a ruthless ruler. But I was human, and Lord Wei was a man who knew how to make a person feel like they were the center of the universe. The breaking point arrived with the first thaw of spring. A messenger from the northern Yan kingdom arrived at the imperial court. The news spread through the palace like wildfire. My older brother, the crown prince of Yan, had died of a sudden illness. The king of Yan was old and frail. Suddenly, I was no longer the discarded, useless hostage prince. I was the heir to the Yan kingdom. The Zhao emperor called an emergency court session. I was summoned. I stood in the center of the great hall, wearing my simple gray robes, surrounded by ministers who were now looking at me not with contempt, but with calculating greed. "Prince Shen," the young emperor spoke from his throne, "the Yan kingdom requests your return. They offer 3 border cities in exchange for your safe passage home." My breath caught. Home. Not the original Shen's home, but freedom. A kingdom. A life far away from the stifling walls of this palace, far away from the overwhelming, terrifying gravity of Lord Wei. "I accept," I said immediately, before anyone else could speak. "I will return to Yan." "He will not." The voice cut through the hall like a drawn sword. Lord Wei stepped down from his position near the throne. He was dressed in full armor today, the silver plates clinking ominously with every step. He walked until he was standing directly beside me. "Lord Wei?" The emperor looked confused. 3 cities is a generous offer." "Prince Shen is too valuable," Lord Wei said, his voice hard, his eyes fixed forward. He didn't look at me. "If he returns, he becomes king. Yan will rebuild its armies. He is a threat." Then what do you propose? A minister asked nervously. He stays, Lord Wei said. The absolute finality in his voice made a chill run down my spine. He remains in Zhao, under my personal custody. I turned to stare at him. You cannot do this, I hissed, my mask of indifference finally cracking. This is a violation of the treaty. Lord Wei finally turned his head to look at me. His dark eyes were raging, entirely stripped of the calculated control he usually maintained. I can do whatever I want, he said softly, so only I could hear. And I will burn the treaty before I let you walk away from me. The court was dismissed. I was not allowed to return to my courtyard. Instead, Lord Wei's guards escorted me to his personal estate, a massive, heavily guarded compound near the heart of the palace. I was taken to a luxurious bedchamber, decorated in rich ebony and silver, smelling deeply of his sandalwood incense. I paced the floor like a trapped animal. I was angry. I was furious. I had almost touched freedom. When the door finally opened hours later, night had fallen. Lord Wei stepped into the room. He had removed his armor, wearing only a loose, dark silk inner robe. His hair was slightly unbound, falling over his shoulders. He looked tired, but the possessive fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "Let me go," I said, the moment the door clicked shut. "No." He walked to the center of the room, pouring a cup of tea. "You are insane," I snapped, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "You despise the original me. You left me to die in a freezing courtyard, and now that I don't want you, you are willing to risk a war to keep me?" Lord Wei slammed the teacup onto the table. The ceramic shattered, tea spilling over the wood. He turned, grabbing me by the waist and pulling me hard against his chest. I gasped, my hands flying up to press against his shoulders. His heart was hammering wildly beneath the thin silk of his robe. "You think I don't know that?" he snarled, his face inches from mine. "You think I don't wake up every night, remembering how you looked at me in that library, telling me the man who loved me burned to ash? It haunts me, Shen. You haunt me." "Then let me leave," I shouted, pushing against him. "I can't," he shouted back, his voice breaking violently. He grabbed the back of my head, holding me so tightly against him I could barely breathe. "I can't. I spent 3 years ignoring a boy who was too weak, too desperate. But then you woke up. You looked at me with eyes that could cut glass. You defied me. You matched me. You became the only thing in this rotting palace that makes me feel alive." His breathing was ragged, heavy. He pressed his forehead against mine. I stopped struggling. The sheer, overwhelming emotion radiating from him was paralyzing. "You don't love me," I whispered, my voice trembling for the first time. "You love the chase? You love what you can't conquer." "I have conquered kingdoms," he murmured, his lips brushing against my temple. "They bored me. You terrify me." He moved his hands from my waist to my face, cupping my cheeks. His thumbs stroked my skin, incredibly gentle for a man whose hands were built for war. "I know the man who loved me is dead," Lord Wei whispered, his dark eyes searching mine, entirely stripped of his pride. "But I am begging the man who took his place. Let me love you." I stared at him. The modern archivist inside me, the man who lived a quiet, safe, loveless life, was screaming at me to run, to use logic, to protect myself. But as Lord Wei's thumb traced my lower lip, as his body heat enveloped me, the logic melted. I didn't step back. I didn't push him away. I slowly raised my hands, my fingers curling into the dark silk of his robe. Lord Wei let out a ragged exhale, like a man who had been suffocating and finally found air. He leaned down, and his mouth captured mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, heavy, and consuming. It was the kiss of a man who was terrified I would vanish into thin air if he didn't anchor me to him with his own body. He backed me toward the edge of the large wooden bed, his hands moving feverishly over my waist, pulling me impossibly flush against him. I gasped into his mouth, and he took advantage of it, his tongue sweeping inside, tasting of dark tea and burning possession. My hands tangled in his long hair, pulling him closer, surrendering to the overwhelming sensual gravity that had been building between us for months. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathless, chest heaving against chest in the dim candlelight of the room. He looked down at me, his eyes dark, heavy with a hunger that promised I would not be sleeping tonight. "You are staying," he whispered, his voice a rough vibration against my skin. "You are mine now. Not the hostage, not the prince. You." I looked at the Grand General, the most feared man in the empire, completely brought to his knees by the soul of an archivist who just wanted a cup of tea. "If I stay," I breathed, my hands resting on his chest, "I want control of the Imperial Library." Lord Wei let out a deep, genuine laugh, the sound rich and beautiful. He pressed a heavy, lingering kiss to the side of my neck. "You can have the library, Shen," he murmured against my skin, sending a shiver straight through my core. "You can have the palace. You can have the empire. Just don't ever look at me with empty eyes again." I didn't. From that night on, the cold, forgotten courtyard was a thing of the past. The hostage prince who died of a broken heart was laid to rest, and in his place, a new king of the palace was born. If you want the next part, the uncensored continuation, and more unlimited 18+ Ancient Royal BL stories, come join Spicy Ancient BL on Patreon. The link is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment.